I want to talk about what in the world might be going on inside the brain of someone who's not craving and therefore not suffering. I ask myself, what is the nature of the brain of a Buddha or a saint or the nature of anyone who's in a very peak performing, peak functioning, joyful, creative, flow state? Or even what's going on in the brain of someone or oneself when one is being equanimous in the face of difficulty, or retaining a sense of underlying fulfillment and satisfaction, even when one is disappointed, or is holding on to a felt sense of being included and of worth and cared about, even if one was, rejected in love or didn't get the job one wanted. How do we actually do this? How do we actually promote those states of brain of the not-craving brain? So that's what this section is going to be about. Okay, so I'm going to go through these topics here. I'm going to go through the first three actually, fairly briskly, and then I want to really preserve time for several practices and methods we can do for strengthening the natural state of the brain, its responsive mode, which is characterized, as we'll see, by calm, contentment, and caring. All right, so that's my general plan, and I'll slow down for questions and discussion at one or 2 points during the first 3 bullets. All right? So, let's dive in. Evolution, right? What a long, strange trip it's been, 3.5 billion years of life, 600 million years or so of evolution of the nervous system, which arose when multi-celled creatures became complex enough that their sensory systems and motor systems needed to communicate with each other. Those communications were, of course, information, thus the beginnings of the nervous system to convey information back and forth in efficient ways between sensory motor systems and within sensory motor systems, and upon that very primal architecture of things like sponges, in the ancient seas, then developed the nervous systems of little crabs or trilobites, 500 or 300 million years ago, and then early, more complex fish, land creatures, mammals 200 or so million years ago, primates 60 million or so years ago, hominids who could manufacture stone tools about 2.5 million years ago with brains a third our size, then modern humans about 150,000 years ago, and then ultra-modern humans around 50,000 years ago. Biological evolution keeps going. How many of you have blue, green, or hazel eyes? Don't be ashamed. You are mutants. You are all X-men and women. No one had blue eyes. Really, literally, DNA studies have shown no one who at least passed on their genes had blue eyes until about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, roughly in the area of Denmark. Some little boy or little girl was born with bright blue eyes who was very popular and had a lot of grandchildren who were popular themselves, and you're sitting here in the room today. So evolution keeps on going. As the brain evolved down that long, strange trip, it did so roughly and simplistically, and yet, I think, usefully to consider in 3 basic stages. The so-called reptilian brain, mammalian brain, and then primate human brain. Okay? In terms of this development, which evolved essentially like a tree, kind of up and out, the brain developed 3 fundamental motivational systems that originated in these different parts of the brain. The first system avoids harm. As I said earlier, rule 1 in the wild is eat lunch, don't be lunch, right? So, and the primal emotion is, of course, fear. So early creatures, they were very good at avoiding harm, which included the exercise of the primal, original parasympathetic nervous system to freeze. All right. If you know Stephen Porges and his brilliant polyvagal theory, the evolution of the vagus nerve occurred in 3 major stages that related to its 3 major branches that also correlate with those 3 stages in terms of motivational system. And the original stage of the vagus nerve has to do with parasympathetic activation, which also involves freezing. Okay, that's avoiding harm. Then layered on top of it came the later reptilian brain and the early mammalian brain with structures that sit on top of the brainstem and then took on a life of their own in the limbic system that's very focused on approaching reward. Instead of avoiding sticks, we approach carrots. And we can do so in more nuanced ways that control breathing and accelerating the heart rate. That's where the sympathetic wing of the autonomic nervous system evolved so that we can pursue those rewards and, frankly, fight or flee in a more successful, sophisticated, and nuanced way. And then layered on top of that comes the primate and human brain, which is very, very focused on attaching to us. Yes, early mammals like mice, let's say, and also birds, as well as other species like octopuses, certain kinds of cephalopods are quite social, really social behavior and its related experiences of bonding, love, altruism, cooperation, and related functions like language and sharing of food really evolved and developed in primates and then in particular in humans. Okay, so that's the overarching structure in which the brain evolved. And this framework, this way of thinking about the operation of the brain has been for me very useful. The crux is function. In other words, the function of avoiding hazard, approaching reward, or attaching to us, not anatomy, although these three systems have been very shaped by the anatomy in which they originated, in terms of the avoiding system being shaped by brainstem activation in nature. It has probably not escaped your attention that the avoiding system is rooted in anatomies that are slow to learn. Right? That has a lot of clinical implications, right? So I'll leave it at that. Here's a little cartoon that kind of summarizes these three functions. I like this kind of thing, Even though it's a simplification, I think it's a useful fiction to think about the inner iguana. I think of the inner rat. I have a lot of nice feeling for rats. I don't know. My mom, who's no longer alive, was phobic about rats. We inadvertently sent her a photograph of our daughter with our pet rat, this wonderful, sweet rat, sitting on her daughter's chest, or shoulder, rather. My mom nearly threw up when she saw the photograph alone. But anyway, I like rats. I think back to the days of the dinosaurs, that ruled the earth in Jurassic Park. They thought they were so special, didn't they? But those little rat-like ancestors hiding in the bushes, coming out especially at night because they were warm-blooded, that's an advantage. They lived on after, the comet asteroid hit the Earth, around 65 million years ago, and the dinosaurs disappeared. So I like rats. Anyway, and then there's the, I think of the inner monkey, inner caveman, cavewoman. That's the more cerebral stuff. All right, so now, what's the thing? We can't turn these off. Actually, I'll stay here for the moment. We cannot get rid of the lizard brain. We cannot get rid of the, rat brain. We cannot get rid of monkey mind, right? But what we can do is alter or shape the mode of activation that we're in terms of these three fundamental systems. And when we do that, then we're moving into a different frame. We're moving into a frame that's not focused around survival activation, but a frame that's more focused on well-being, on the reduction of suffering and harm, and the increase in happiness and benefit for ourselves and others. How do we do it? That's what I want to talk about here. So the natural state of the brain, when a person is not disturbed, is actually, as we'll see momentarily, a really good place. Basically, when people are not disturbed, the avoiding system naturally defaults to a state of relative calm characterized by lots of parasympathetic activation. Not in the reactive mode of freezing, but in the ordinary parasympathetically dominated, in some sense of that word, mode of mellow, relaxed, easygoing. We're okay. All right? Second, in terms of the approaching system, when people are not frustrated, not disappointed, not thwarted in their goals, they tend to default to a state of basic contentment, ease, and well-being. I should also say when they're not disturbed biochemically. All right? People worldwide generally report that when they're not rattled, you kind of feel sort of okay. It's mild on the 0 to 10 scale of positive affect. It's a 1 or a 2, but it's pervading. There's a basic sense of contentment. And third, when people, again, are not disturbed, they tend to default to a state of caring. Altruism, taking good care of strangers, jumping into rivers to rescue dogs, they don't know, or whose human pets, I think humans are pets of dogs, but anyway, the human pets do not know. They'll jump into the river altruistically, risking their own life to save those others. We tend to pay a lot of attention to departures from these three. We pay attention to angry, fearful activations or acts of war, genocide, gross unkindness and conflict. Okay, but that's a little bit like the clouds moving through the sky. They draw our attention, but the sky itself dwarfs those clouds. So this is the brain in its responsive mode, including, I think, a kind of creativity, a generativity, using Erik Erikson's term, for a life in which we're producing, whether it's producing a new garden or a loaf of bread, or the generativity of learning a new skill. There's a kind of fundamental creativity or generativity, a contribution that emerges when the brain is in its natural responsive mode. Here's a little graphic here. Our daughter did this. She's now 21. We have 2 kids, my wife and I, 23 and 21. Let's see, and I use the word affiliate for the attaching system. I've chosen to use the attaching word for my model here, even though it has potentially negative connotations, particularly in a Buddhist world. I think there's a lot to be said about attachment, healthy attachment, and so forth, obviously. Okay, so that's a picture here. I think it's helpful to appreciate that behind the obscurations, to use the Tibetan phrase, behind the obscurations, there is a naturally positive state of being. And as a Lord of the Rings junkie, I'm quoting here, in the darkest moment, pretty much, in the trilogy, as Sam, who's helping Frodo, who's bearing the Ring of Power, crawl up the slopes of the exploding volcano, Mount Doom, while evil forces are trying to find them. They're broken down, weary, and hungry. Their friends outside of Mordor are being slaughtered by overwhelming forces. It's the darkest hour. Nonetheless, through the clouds that are the symbol of Mordor, through the obscurations of confusion, ignorance, or delusion, Sam sees through them the light that was always already there. I just like that quote a lot. All right, I'm a sucker for that. All right, the responsive mode is very important. For one, it fuels us. It tops up our tanks for necessary reactive mode, which I'll get to momentarily, reactive mode mobilizations. Also, the responsive mode is how we recover from pouring out. The problem, of course, the first book I wrote was called Mother Nurture. Penguin published it in 2002. It was about taking good care of mothers and also couples with kids for the long haul, not just the first few months postpartum, after which mothers fall off the radar of the healthcare system as if they've stopped pouring out. And one of the notions I developed was of a depleted mother syndrome that I think a significant fraction of mothers transit through, very often 2, 3, 4 years out, or after something particularly draining happens. It's important to appreciate that if we're pouring out and we're not refueling, after a while we start running on fumes. Whether we're a mother, whether we're a father, or whether we're just doing anything that involves lots and lots of demands upon us. As you probably know from what's called the stress diathesis model in healthcare, course is pretty much determined by, it's an equation with 3 variables. Challenges or demands, stressors upon a person, hitting vulnerabilities, diatheses they're called, vulnerabilities, offset by resources. So as stresses or as demands go up, or as vulnerabilities go up, or as both go up, it's very important for resources to go up as well. And that's where the responsive mode comes in. It's also the case that the responsive mode fuels positive outlook, fuels positive behaviors, those create positive cycles, and also the responsive mode fuels virtue and benevolence. 2 key attributes, right? Those words, by the way, I had a client of mine who quoted them to me. She was a high-tech person, very dynamic, very organized, but she had heard those words from some Zen talk at one point, virtue and benevolence, which Zen has no monopoly on, obviously. And, those words have been in her mind, they've been in my mind as well. Kind of, if in doubt, virtue and benevolence, it's hard to go wrong. I'd throw in mindfulness as well, and there we are. In any case, it's helpful to appreciate that the responsive mode, which feels good, usually, is good for other people. Sometimes people are afraid to take in the good or feel good as if it's selfish or vain, or somehow, just a kind of trivial cherry on the frosting on the cake. But actually, it's the cake, because as many studies have shown, people are more inclined to be pro-social. They're more inclined to be patient, to be generous, to be able to work cooperatively when their own cup runneth over. As you can see in the quote here from Bertrand Russell, good people are happy people. Not because so much goodness makes you happy, but rather happiness inclines us to be good. That's the good news. Now here's the bad news, the reactive mode, as it were. To cope with urgent needs, we leave home. We leave our home base and we kick into the reactive mode. There's a place for the reactive mode, but let's be clear about what it is and what its costs are that need to be netted against its benefits. So, for example, in terms of the avoiding system, if we feel unsafe or threatened, either based on something happening right now or something coming up in ourselves, it's important to appreciate, I think, that the great majority actually, of inputs into the brain, into the central nervous system, and then up through the central nervous system into the brain, come from within the organism itself, come within the body itself. All right? So if any kind of threat message comes up, which could include the longing for love, which historically is associated with pain and therefore is threatening, could trigger the avoiding system into gear. All right? Or, for example, what if we're frustrated? We can't approach a goal. We can't get that carrot, right? We're disappointed. We're frustrated. We're thwarted. We're blocked. Or maybe we have an internalized sense of learned helplessness, which humans, as I'll talk about momentarily, are very vulnerable to. Mammals in general are very vulnerable to learned helplessness. If that comes up as well, boom, the reactive mode of the approaching system kicks into gear. Or, let's say we feel separated. We feel cast out. We feel dissed. We come home, watch my eyes, and our teenager does this to us. Rolls their eyes, whatever. Something comes up. We're on the receiving end of disdain. Or maybe we feel ashamed, which is a social emotion, or guilty. Then too, boom, the attaching system kicks into its reactive mode. It's a kind of inner homelessness. The problem is, for many people, reactive mode functioning becomes the new normal. It's the water they swim in, like the veritable, proverbial fish that doesn't realize it's wet. Right. This is the reactive triangle. Have to have a graphic here. All right. See again, a little detail here. How many of you know something of Buddhist psychology or Buddhism in general? Just ballpark. Okay, great. This will be a familiar term. In that frame, which I name not to push it, but to kick its tires to see what might be relevant or useful there for us today. As the Buddha himself famously said, see for yourself. All right? So it's in that frame, of course, that I'm talking here. In Buddhism, there are the so-called three poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion. All right? If you think about it, greed maps to the approaching system, hatred maps to the avoiding system, and delusion or ignorance kind of surrounds them all. The ignorance that doesn't realize that everything is continually changing and everything is connected to everything else, so that nothing arises on its own, and the ignorance that fails to realize that if we resist those two facts of impermanence and interdependence, we create suffering and harm. All right? That's the fundamental essence of the Four Noble Truths. So, in any case, it's interesting, though, that the Buddha left out heartache. If you pick a single word for a disturbance of the approaching system, I myself would add heartache. It's implicit in some of his teaching, but I think that the approaching system, which, if you think about it, as the brain tripled in size the last 2.5 million years, which it did from the time our ancestors first began manufacturing tools, much of the build-out of the brain, that 2/3 of cortex largely, that's been evolved in the last 2.5 million years. which is pretty short if you think about 600 million years of evolution of a nervous system, much of that build-out is dedicated to social functions, to love, broadly defined, because the reproductive advantages, love that phrase, which are the engine of biological evolution, the reproductive advantages within hunter-gatherer bands that were better at love, broadly defined, stitched those advantages into DNA and into the human brain, fundamentally. This is the social brain theory, it's called, and very arguably, certainly over the last several million years, if not even longer, love, broadly defined, has been the primary driver of the evolution of the brain. So it's in that context here that I think that the attaching system stands at its own feet. It is functionally distinct. It draws on the other two for its functions, to be sure, but it's functionally distinct. It's certainly neurologically, neuroanatomically distinct. And that's why I think it's important to talk about the four poisons, greed, hatred, heartache, and delusion. Okay, my 2 cents. So, here's the deal though. The problem is that the reactive mode is very powerful in terms of urgency and intensity, and particularly to the extent that it's embedded in ancient brainstem and limbic system functions, it is quite inflexible in its activations. Now, I think it's important to appreciate that the reactive mode is necessary, it's normal. Sometimes there are reactive mode activations that have associations to positive affect, like jumping up and down when, forgive me if it's not your team, the San Francisco Giants won the World Series last year. That was yippee! All right, some hands here, good. That is reactive mode activation, all right? But we have to be careful because as soon as we go into reactive mode, even if it's affectively positive, we're vulnerable to get tipped into more primal threat response or stress response activations. You ever notice that when you're really excited, it's easy to tip into anger? Because you're just already really close in terms of biological activation. All right? It's also the case that extremes of reactive mode activation are found in the psychiatric psychological classification of mental disorders. And here's an interesting clustering of some, not all, but some well-known diagnoses. This is insurance classifications here we get paid for sometimes. Diagnoses clustered in terms of these 3 systems. For example, if you think of it, it's disorders of the avoiding system are anxiety disorders, or disorders of anger, or PTSD. Disorders often in the attaching system include things like narcissistic personality disorder, borderline conditions, or more general, murkier, more common messes like simply looking for love in all the wrong places. All right? Okay. Now I want to talk about, in particular, a subset or aspect of the avoiding system that has to do with the negativity bias and threat reactivity, which I alluded to very briefly, in my first talk here. In other words, a key component of the reactive mode is to scan for threat. It looks for bad news to keep us alive, and then when it finds it, reacts intensely, stores it immediately, once burned, twice shy, and then stores it in such a way that it can be reactivated at anything that remotely resembles bad news, whether that signal that resembles bad news comes from outside us or, frankly, more commonly, from inside us. Why did we develop a negativity bias? That's where I think it's quite helpful, and I've, by the way, found this very helpful with clients. It normalizes the negativity bias. It helps them understand it. In a sense, it depathologizes it, and yet shines the spotlight on it as, yeah, Houston, we've got a problem, we got to deal with this sort of thing, because it affects us routinely and also affects those around us. So while it's important in evolution to get those carrots, right, and avoid those sticks, it's more important generally to avoid sticks. Because if you fail to get a carrot today, you'll probably have a chance at a carrot tomorrow. But if you fail to avoid a stick today, whap, no more carrots forever. Sticks have an urgency and a survival impact that carrots usually lack. All right? With the negativity bias, in effect, the avoiding system takes over. Rule 1, don't be lunch. It takes over and it co-opts the approaching and attaching systems to its purposes, either inhibiting them or using them for its ends. This has a lot of consequences. This list here is just a kind of summary. By the way, I should have mentioned in the back of the first slide set are 5 slides worth of references, 1 slide on, I think, really good books, and then 4 slides on papers of various kinds, I think kind of greatest hits in a way in this area of self-directed neuroplasticity. In that list of references are 2 papers that summarize a lot of the research on the negativity bias. I don't think you have them in your handout. I'll have to mail them to you. One of those papers is called The Negativity Bias. The other is called Bad is Stronger Than Good. Not that bad is better than good, but bad is stronger than good. And if you're interested, you can see more about this stuff there. Okay, just some highlights. One is that, as I said, it's easy to learn helplessness. Studies on animals and humans have shown that you can train mammals very quickly in half a dozen trials in a sense of helplessness and futility and despair. Trapped and can't do anything. Trapped and defeated, right? And which is the hallmark basis for depression. And yet, unfortunately, even though it might take only a handful of trials to train a human or another animal in helplessness, it takes many dozens of trials, sometimes over 100 trials, to the point of absurdity. Sounds like therapy, right? That's why Freud called it the impossible profession, to have a person realize that they can do something, that they're the cue ball instead of the 8 ball in certain key areas of their life. That's why I think it's so important to pay attention to where we do have some efficacy, even if it's only inside our mind. I think about the famous writing of Viktor Frankl, the founder of logotherapy, a Holocaust survivor out of Auschwitz. To paraphrase, he said, even there, in the worst places on earth, for me at least, tied for last place is hell on earth, the concentration camps. Even there were people who, through offering a bit of a smile or the last crust of bread or their attitude about being there, demonstrated that most fundamental and irreducible of human freedoms, the freedom to choose how we will respond to our circumstances, right? If only inside our mind. Sometimes I think, frankly, when I watch the news, I watch politics, I think to myself sometimes, you may have my body, you may have my tax dollars, but you may have my White House or whatever, but you do not have my mind, all right? Okay, that's where I think often people have opportunities for efficacy, greater opportunities than in their body or out there in the world, which of course are also important places to intervene in. But we typically have less power there in the body or in the world, and we usually don't take the benefits with us wherever we go, which is what we do. The title of John Kabat-Zinn's classic book on mindfulness, wherever you go, there you are, So we take these results wherever we go. A couple more examples, then I'll move on. One that strikes me is John Gottman's finding, great researcher on couples counseling, that in happy long-term couples, there's almost always at least a 5-to-1 ratio of positive interactions to negative ones, implying that a single negative interaction is more powerful than 5 positive ones. All right? That's a cautionary tale, isn't it? Another detail at the very bottom is that, as I said earlier, negative experiences go right into implicit memory. But positive experiences, unless they're million-dollar moments, have plain vanilla systems. And that means they have to be held in awareness 10, 20, 30 seconds in a row, ideally with repetition and some intensity, to transfer from short-term memory buffers to long-term storage. How often do we actually do that? That means, as I said, positive experiences flow through like water through a sieve, but negative experiences are caught every time. Unfortunately, building up a pile of negative experiences in implicit memory. In effect, the brain is like Velcro for negative experiences, but Teflon for positive ones. Okay? Another key example of the negativity bias is threat reactivity. If you think about it, in the wild, there are 2 mistakes you can make. You can think there's a tiger in the bushes about to pounce, but really the coast is clear, all right? Or you could think everything's fine, feeling groovy, but a tiger's about to get you. What's the cost of the first mistake? Anxiety, right? Phobias, okay. Suffering, what's the cost of the second mistake? Let's all make the sound together. Forget it, you lose. So Mother Nature wants us to make the first mistake hundreds, thousands of times over to avoid making the second mistake even once. And this evolutionary tendency shows up at individuals, organizations, nations. The last 12 years are a great teaching in threat reactivity and what I call paper tiger paranoia. And this tendency can be exacerbated by temperament, life experiences, culture, and frankly politics. In a story that's been told 10,000 times, where groups play on fear to gain or hold on to political power. What are the results? One, we make cognitive errors. Our appraisals are wrong. People routinely, as a default setting, overestimate threats and underestimate opportunities and underestimate resources inside themselves or in their life to capture or fulfill opportunities or deal with threats. Some people go the other way. With them, we're trying to say, there's a real tiger there. Be careful. Wake up. Okay. But the default setting of the brain is to make this mistake. And then we update these appraisals with information and confirms them and end up with a view of the world that is selective and fundamentally biased. This has a lot of cost. I'll be wrapping up momentarily so we can talk about this and anything else you like, and then we'll go into some practices. You know, this is not an exhaustive list. It's easy to go political here. I'm not going to do that. Try to bring it down to person and clinical practice. But it's easy to see, for example, even in our own life, that if we feel particularly threatened, we're going to put resources into walls, you know, piling up gold and guns, metaphorically or perhaps even literally. We invest there rather than in exploratory, reward-seeking, approaching behaviors. We also do things that create self-fulfilling, in a sense, prophecies. For example, in the fourth bullet down, if we feel threatened, and you see this in couples counseling, you see this in where people talk about their life at work or at home, outside of the therapy hour. If we feel threatened, we tend to act threatened, and we tend to act, you know, in various ways. We throw up walls, we go on the counterattack, we do preemptive strikes, etc. And then the person on the receiving end, right, of our feeling threatened behavior looks at us and goes, whoa, and now suddenly we're a threat to them. So they act in ways that then tell us, yeah, I knew you were a jerk all along. Right? That's the vicious cycle part. Also, the avoiding system inhibits the approaching system, so we play small dreams, muzzle ourselves, don't speak truth to power, don't have the courage it takes to open our heart. Also, in terms of the attaching system, typically when we feel threatened, we tend to hold fast to our tribe, our particular group, and tend to fear and attack them. Bottom line it, we cannot choose whether we have avoiding, approaching, and attaching systems. But what we can do is affect what fundamental mode of operation we're in. I think often in therapy, and I've definitely done this a ton, we tend to work with people literally as if we're trying to build a house on a shaky foundation. We're trying to address symptoms or surface factors that rest on underlying chronic reactive mode activation, with little sense in the person of the responsive mode or capacity to center there. All right? That's why I think that it's really important, obviously, deal with pressing clinical concerns, but also keep in mind the more global, contextual reactive mode activation in which those clinical concerns or issues present themselves. And also be active in stimulating and therefore strengthening the neural substrates of the responsive mode. Otherwise, we're addressing the frosting, but not dealing with the cake. Okay, questions or comments so far?
I'm a little confused about the terminology you're using for systems. The affiliation system and attachment system makes sense to me, and I understand how you're using that, but avoid as a system and approach as a system, I don't completely understand So I'm wondering if you could give synonyms or other things we're more familiar with in psychology or even in Buddhism.
Okay, sure. So I think we all heard the question. By system, I mean basically a collection, a basket of skills, triggers, behaviors, perceptions, and often related motivations. And the reason I use the word system in part is to appreciate the fact that let's suppose, we are faced with a situation where we feel threatened. We're driving in traffic and we're stuck between two large trucks on the freeway, which is my wife's worst nightmare, all right? So how do we deal with that? Well, we can mount different kinds of responses, For example, in the reactive mode, the heart might start beating faster. We also might curiously, which is not very healthy when you're driving between two trucks, start feeling sleepy and kind of dissociative and frozen with intense parasympathetic activation, of freezing. We might have that happen. We also might activate functions that are more language-based or more prefrontal cortex-based, where we talk to ourselves. We talk ourselves off the ledge. We remind ourselves that those trucks are driving. We tell ourselves that we can speed up or slow down. There are many, many different ways to deal with that particular issue. So the trigger is threat, something to avoid, right? The trigger could be pain in the body, right? Anything that feels threatening or potentially harmful. The trigger could be a memory, a traumatic memory from childhood. Or the trigger could be a fear of some loss, let's say. And then we have a whole basket of ways of dealing with it. I just think of that basket in a way that's kind of commonly used in neuroscience, more like a system, sort of loosely. What's been helpful for me is not to over-localize these three functions. A different word would be function. The function that's served. Are we avoiding harm? Are we approaching reward? Are we attaching to us? Certain situations integrate all of them. For example, maybe we avoid harm by approaching building walls, or fixing the roof. We have a leak in our roof that's harming our home, right? We avoid that harm by approaching good contractors to repair the roof. Or we avoid that harm by attaching to a friend who had a similar problem and reminds us that it doesn't need to be a big deal, and here's a good referral for someone who can fix it. You see? That's what I mean.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to ask how you think something like socioeconomic status plays into all of this. I mean, especially given, like you've already said, how cortisol can really, be very destructive to overall health and even affect lifespan and things like that. But in terms of whether somebody is, for example, primarily functioning out of a more responsive mode or out of a more reactive mode.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I appreciate that in its own right and in a larger sense too. So first, specifically, I think real life matters a ton. I think often sometimes as a therapist, I'm just patching people up who are staggering off the battlefield of unemployment, economic stress, sexism, discrimination on, sexual orientation, ageism, whatever, lots of those sorts of things. And those are very real factors. I think basically if we want to make things better, there are three basic domains to intervene on, which I alluded to previously, out there in the world, here in the body, here in the mind. And of course they intertwine. All three are really important. One is not more important than the other. I'm talking here about the mind, obviously, because that's my focus in work and what most of us do professionally, not all of us. But all three are very important places to intervene in. And I think it's respectful and clients appreciate it when we acknowledge those real factors. Those really matter. That said, I think of the saying from Shantideva, who's a great Tibetan teacher in the 8th century. He said, essentially to paraphrase, we encounter a world that's full of thorns and brambles and sharp rocks, etc. And we basically have two choices. Either we cover the world with leather, or we put on a pair of shoes. And that's where personal practice comes in. Yes, we do what we can to make the world a better place. And I think that's incredibly important, particularly as, humanity kind of, proceeds at a breakneck pace to the brink. But meanwhile, it really also helps to do personal practices that gradually train the mind and therefore the brain for the better over time. But it really helps people, I've found, to acknowledge the impact on real physical material factors, both here and now and in their history. And the other thing I wanted to say that I appreciate in what you brought up there is the way that it brings in another view. And there's a Zen saying, nothing left out, but one of the things you should not leave out is that you're always going to leave things out. Every view is partial. A middle-aged male, middle class, heterosexual, kind of a nerd. I'm a certain person, and I'm going to leave stuff out inevitably. That's why I particularly appreciate people bringing in other views. Okay. How about a little practice here, all right? So, how do we do it? Ambitious. See, in Buddhist psychology, there are 3 basic types: greed, hatred, and delusion types. There's probably a 4th type, heartache type. But anyway, I'm kind of a greed type, so I like to cover a lot. So hopefully I'll be able to get through most of these, even maybe all of them, in a meaningful way. So this is not an exhaustive list. I just want to explore some, to me, low-hanging fruit of ways to, as she brought up, really encourage the responsive mode, both during the counseling or therapy or whatever, group work, what have you, time, or coaching work, and in addition, outside of, formal times with us. Okay, so first, parasympathetic activation. The parasympathetic wing of the nervous system essentially is the antidote to stress-based activations of the sympathetic fight-or-flight wing of the autonomic nervous system. They're connected like on a seesaw. When one goes up, it pushes the other one down. Modern life, a lot, is a chronic activation of sympathetic systems. That's why I think it's particularly helpful to have various methods, a number of which are listed in the slide, various methods for nurturing sympathetic activation, both as a resting state, so we have a deeper keel in the water, as it were, but when the storms come along, and also to be able situationally to mount a parasympathetic response when we're getting triggered. It's helpful to appreciate that the same neural and hormonal systems that evolved to get us away from charging lions and aggression between and within primate bands, those same systems are locked and loaded today when we get upset, when we feel frustrated or anxious, or encounter a frown across the dinner table. And they have the same consequences in terms of the impact of cortisols as well as through other pathways on our physical and mental health. So you want to do a few practices for parasympathetic, a couple quick ones. One is long exhalations. So if you could, for the next 30 seconds or so, inhale normally or even a little briskly, and then try to have your exhalation be at least twice as long. Maybe count the inhalation and then double the count or even longer as you exhale. And we'll do that for about half a minute. You might try this with your eyes open, because often we need to do this one. We've got to have our eyes open. And then adding one more thing, as you continue the long exhalations, relax your tongue. The parasympathetic system is sometimes called the rest and digest system, distinct from fight or flight sympathetic activation. Well, where does digesting begin? In the mouth, which is full of parasympathetic fibers. So long exhaling while relaxing the tongue. Okay. Want to call out anything you noticed? Was it relaxing a little bit? It's really hard to be uptight about something or really upset after 3 to 10 long exhalations. The stress needle may not come back down to 0, but it usually moves from a 7 back down to a 4 at least. One nice thing I like about these methods as a guy who has done business consulting, been in the business world a lot, it's great to be able to do things like this privately. No one can need to notice you're doing long exhalations, or clients are. Obviously, people need to not get triggered by attending to the breath, but that's what it does, because the parasympathetic system handles exhaling, and the sympathetic system handles inhaling. That's why the heart speeds up slightly when we inhale and exhales slightly when we exhale. All right? I think it's also helpful to have physical pleasure. Physical pleasure tends to be parasympathetically arousing because it satisfies the needs in the moment of the approaching reward-seeking system. I have worked with people very depressed sometimes. When all else fails, and there's no guarantee of the strategy, but I think one way in is through physical pleasure, because you have to destroy a brain, basically, to eliminate its capacity to feel physical pleasure. Even if a person is severely depressed, they will say that, roses smell good, it feels good to take a drink of water on a hot and muggy day, leaving this room and finding air conditioning in a bed will feel good. These things feel good even if one is severely depressed. All right? And then if you're really into it, this is more Buddhist at the bottom, although, again, it doesn't have to be Buddhist, just looking at bodily activation as one more mental content. Even with language like, there is fear, rather than, I am afraid. Sure, sometimes we want to help people own their experience. There's a place for that. But very often I think it's helpful so people can distance from their experience so they can be with it and then start to release it and replace it when it's problematic. So the language of there is anger, there is stress, there is upset, there is tension in the belly, there is feeling awful rather than I feel awful. And then one can regard, particularly with practice, those contents of mind as just one more cloud. Yes, a dark and stormy one, but just one more cloud moving through the sky-like space of awareness. Okay? And obviously, there are lots and lots of other ways to build up parasympathetic activation, both as resting state and situationally. But to me, this is kind of a nice way in that I've used with clients that I think is very accessible. Okay? All right. Next one, taking in the good. Critical way to move into the responsive mode. For one, it forces us to notice what's good. That itself can relieve the disturbance, the frustration, the loss, the sense of threat that drives reactive activation. All right? But to truly take in the good, to truly weave positive experiences into the fabric of the brain and therefore the self, we have to stay with them. And so these are the 3 steps of taking in the good. If you want to see more about this particular method, which for me is not a therapy, but it's a key function of good, or a key component rather, of good therapy or other paths of practice or even spiritual life, you can look on my website, which is listed in the first slide. I'll just tell you now, you can find it easily, buddhisbrain.com. That website is very full of freely offered resources, including the slide sets from almost all of the workshops I've ever taught, including workshops I do for therapists on taking in the good, including a lot of specific clinical applications and twists and turns. So you can find out more there if you want. Okay. And feel free to use that material in your own training or with other people. It's freely offered. All right. So these are the 3 steps. You want to try it? So let's just do it. Pick a good fact. It could be something you feel grateful for in life altogether. It could be even a sense of something good in yourself, which is a kind of fact I think is so important to pay attention to. Or maybe recently you got something done, or maybe recently you just got away from something that was going to be a problem. All right? Recently, my wife and I thought we were going to have to pay a lot more in taxes, but it looks like kind of okay so far. So that's a good fact. Then, in the first step, let yourself have a good experience related to the good fact. You're deliberately trying to have a good experience here. And see what that's like altogether, to deliberately try to activate a good experience. Probably mild, and yet still good. And then move into the second and third steps of staying with, savoring and relishing the positive experience. As you can, helping it become as big as possible in your body and heart and mind. As a meditation practice almost, stay with it. And then all the while in the third step, sense and intend that it's sinking into you, like water into a sponge, like a soothing golden balm going down into you, soothing and healing, maybe ultimately even replacing old bruises or injuries or lacks. Or when I talk with kids, coming into you like a jewel going into the treasure chest in your heart. As I'm seeing some people do, you can use the power of what's called embodied cognition, maybe a little half smile, or if the good you're taking in is a sense of strength, maybe sitting up a little straighter. Many studies have shown that if we incline the body appropriately a little bit in a positive direction, very often emotions and cognitions will follow. Okay. So that was a little moment, one little moment of taking in the good. Usually will not change a person's life, but I have personally come to really appreciate this method for myself, but certainly also for the people I work with. Because so many people in therapy or out of therapy are having good experiences. Maybe they're realizing something or good events are happening, but they have no experience of it. It doesn't move the needle, right? Or it moves the needle, they feel good momentarily, or they get some gain or some lesson, let's say in therapy broadly defined, and yet it doesn't stick to their ribs, right? They come back the next day or the next week, it's as if they didn't learn anything. How do we help learning, especially emotional and somatic learning? And that's where taking in the good really comes in. I'll run through a couple more methods and then I'll open it up for discussion and then we'll wrap up. Okay? All right, great. Personally, I look for many opportunities each day to take in the good. Little moments. The truth is, if you start looking for the good, you realize that life is strewn, the path of life, the road of life is strewn with pearls. There are all these little good experiences. Flowers bloom, coffee tastes good, people are nice, ain't dead yet, like I said. We're in Santa Fe, air is good. I grew up in LA, smog city, especially when I grew up. This is great air here. I love the air here. Chocolate cupcakes, yummy. All right, whatever it is, go through life with like a vacuum cleaner, sucking those pearls into oneself, stitching them into the fabric of the brain and the self. Okay, next one, feeling cared about. If you think about it, exile in the Serengeti was a death sentence. It's interesting, when I did research for my book on mothers, I saw this chart in one of the things I looked at. It was a figure, and it showed that until shortly after World War I, there were no single mothers in America. There was a base rate of about 4% who were basically women in transition, basically because a woman could not raise a child alone. It takes a village to raise a child, for example. And there are many other examples of ways in which exile would be a death sentence in the Serengeti. So we evolved very, very strong needs to feel included, to feel cared about, to feel wanted and loved. All right? And there's a lot of research, as you've seen, about the power of social support to dampen stress, to reduce pain, and increase recovery from stressful experiences or even health challenges. For example, you probably know the study where people in an MRI that are about to get an unpleasant, not horrible, but unpleasant electrical shock have less activation of the pain networks in their brain if they're allowed to hold the hand of a loved one. They don't get the same benefit if they hold the hand of a nice experimenter in a white lab coat, but they do get the benefit if they hold the hand of someone they know loves them. That's why I've come to really appreciate more and more how feeling cared about and growing an increasingly and growing an internalized sense of those who care about us is really foundational in psychotherapy. So you want to do a little practice for this one? Okay? Feeling cared about. Now, interestingly, sometimes opening to feeling cared about, naturally enough in the neural networks, just goes right there to not feeling cared about. Right? Feeling abandoned, rejected, found wanting, dismissed, what have you. Okay. It's normal when we try to do a positive practice to hit an obstruction. Perfectly normal. To me, both are valuable. You either get the positive result when we do a practice, or we surface an obstruction, which then is an opportunity to work through those three phases. Be with it initially, explore it, discover it, hang out with it, look for its more softer, vulnerable, and younger layers, sink down, observe it, get to know it, and then at that Goldilocks moment, move on to the second phase of helping it out the door, and the third phase then of replacing it, taking in. In 6 words for the 3 phases, let be, let go, let in. That's what those 3 phases are all about. All right. Then we go back to the positive practice. In this case, feeling cared about. So let's try it here. All right? So neuroscience studies have shown that if you start by feeling cared about, that also primes the neural circuits of being caring toward others, including toward the other who wears your own name tag. So even though, I won't get into it here, self-compassion, studies have shown, increasingly is a very important thing. Books are coming out about self-compassion. You may have done trainings about it. I'm going to do a FACES conference that will have Christopher Germer there, doing a 2-day workshop in advance in La Jolla in 2012 on self-compassion, be there or be square or something. Anyway, but it's hard for people to be self-compassionate. A great way to light up those neural networks and warm them up for self-compassion is to start with feeling cared about. Okay, so if you could, bring to mind a being that you know cares about you. It need not be a perfect relationship, but at least that there is a slice of the pie of the relationship altogether in which you matter to that person. Perhaps they simply like you. Honestly, I could bring to mind these guys in the deli across the street from where I work. I've known them for about 5-6 years now. We talk sports, we say hi, we joke. I know they care about me. They'd throw me a life preserver. They'd maybe even jump in after me. Right? It's not perfect love, but they care about me. Or you might even think of someone that you know truly cherishes you. Maybe a being in your life today or in your history. It could be a human, a spiritual force or being. It could be an animal companion. And then on the basis of being with that one, see if you can open to feeling cared about. You might put a hand on the heart or on your cheek as if a very caring grandmother or guardian angel or your pet has crawled into your lap, or you're riding your favorite horse. You feel cared about. You feel connected. Maybe you're part of a group that cares about you. Okay, come on back. Now, this was an example of deliberately trying to activate a positive experience. And there's a place for that. Yet most of the time, we have the opportunity for key positive experiences as we go through the flow of everyday life. And that's where those opportunities are. That's where those pearls are in the pathway of life, to take them into ourselves, including experiences, often modest experiences, of being included, seen, liked, respected, mattering to others, or even cherished and loved. And to help our clients, look for those opportunities and then allow themselves to have the experience of being cared about, and then in particular, stay with the experience of being cared about 10, 20, 30 seconds in a row to really get those neurons to fire together, to wire together experiences of being cared about into the brain. To me, that's a very important practice. And clients often will bring up the obstruction, Freud would call it resistance, I prefer the less pejorative term, obstruction, of that it's an imperfect relationship. And there, sometimes, honestly, I'll tell the story of my own relationship with my mother, who was a very loving person, and yet had, by pretty much everyone's admission, including her own, a fairly large and sometimes difficult personality. So her personality put me off for some time until I finally realized that wasn't good for me or anybody, including her. And I started seeing her love or imagining her love as like a warm campfire behind a lattice work with vines and brambles. All right? And instead of getting preoccupied with the vines and their thorns, I saw through them and felt the warmth and light of the fire that was always there in her heart, that always truly loved me, behind the personality, behind her eyes. You know, for my own good, not to let her off the hook, although that did in some sense do so, but for my own enlightened self-interest, you know, I would zero in on what was there. You know, I know clients who will not drop their grievance, their reproach, which is a word I've come to use a lot in therapy because I think it's so central to so many people. Reproach, a kind of clinging complaint. It's hard for them to drop that, or they fear that they're waiving their rights if they acknowledge the ways that they have been cared about. No, the caring that's come to you is just one more tile in the mosaic. You know, if ignorance is the fundamental root of suffering and harm, you know, wisdom is seeing the whole mosaic, including the tiles that contain some caring. Okay. One more, and two more actually, and then we'll have a little discussion here, and I'll move to a wrap. Feeling stronger and safer, obviously this relates to the avoiding system in particular. People often have opportunities to feel stronger and safer, and yet they don't take advantage of them. So I think that doing, you know, practices either deliberately, like at meals, or just before bed when the brain is very receptive, or especially in daily life when there are opportunities to feel stronger and safer, again, that's a very strong resource for activating the responsive mode, which first and foremost gets hijacked by the reactive mode at any kind of perceived threat. And feeling stronger and safer is a key aspect of dealing with threat. So just for a moment, if you like, two little things. First, bring to mind, if you can, the body memory of feeling strong. Maybe it was in a physical challenge environment, or that last repetition of weight in the gym, or maybe it was a time you really stood up for somebody. See if you can, in your body, get a sense of that strength again. With embodied cognition, you might sit a little straighter, take a little deeper breath. You might even play with keeping your eyes open, because that's so often when we need to feel strong. We'll need to have our eyes open. Maybe there's a steeliness in your gaze. There's an intent, a resolve in you that goes with feeling strong. Nothing macho, no posturing about it, but strength. See what that's like to call up a sense of strength. And notice how it's easier to imagine dealing with, you know, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune in daily life based on an internalized and activated sense of strength. And then building on the sense of strength, imagine, if you can, reasons to feel as safe as you reasonably can. Not perfectly safe. You know, there's no perfect safety in this life, a life that contains inevitably old age, disease, and death, but there can be much greater safety. Most people are much more anxious than they need to be. They're afflicted with paper tiger paranoia. They think life is always threat level orange. It's not. You know, so for example, right now, bring to mind, if you can, the sense of being in a protected setting, among good people, feeling strong yourself, and play around with, if you can, being less guarded, less braced, or less anxious here and now. See what that's like, to deliberately help yourself feel less anxious. Safer, stronger, more at peace. Not at war with anything, including anything in your own experience. To finish up on this particular point, with clients in general, you know, as I said, fear was the first emotion. It's the one that is behind so much else. You know, Mother Nature produces an ongoing trickle of anxiety in us to keep us vigilant, even when there's nothing to be afraid of, right? You know, Keep looking around for those tigers. Even though in psychology it's called signal anxiety, truly it's usually noise, you know? And so appreciating the ways in which we're continually lied to by Mother Nature, in effect, to preserve to promote our physical survival, a little bit like, to use Lord of the Rings again, worm tongue, whispering in our ear, be afraid, be very afraid, watch out, don't lower your guard. The time to feel really afraid is when you're not afraid, right? Don't let worm tongue trick us. Last one, liking and wanting. It's interesting that there are different neural systems for liking and wanting. We like what's pleasant, we dislike what's unpleasant. That's natural. We can't change that in the brain, particularly in the moment. Over time, we can gradually condition what we find enjoyable and pleasant or what we find unpleasant. But generally speaking, in the moment, we can't. This sense of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral is what's called in Western psychology the hedonic tone of experience, or if you know Buddhist psychology, it's called the feeling tone, or the Vedana. And in reaction to the feeling tone, or hedonic tone, of pleasant or unpleasant, then often, typically, we kick into gear wanting. We want the pleasant to continue, we want those carrots, and we also want the unpleasant to end. We want those sticks to go away, right? There's a place, I think, for wholesome wants, but it's a yellow flag condition because it's so easy to tip into problematic levels of wanting. That's why learning to practice with the tipping point between liking and wanting is so helpful, especially, frankly, if we're dealing with people who are grappling with one kind of addiction or other. So, how to do it? There are a variety of ways. You could argue that much of spiritual psychology is about practicing with wanting. Certainly Buddhism is, and it's not alone in that, as well as a lot, of course, of recovery practices, which I have enormous respect for, are about practicing with wanting. I'll just mention a couple here, and then I'll move on to a few questions, and then we'll wrap up. So, one thing to do is to surround the pleasant or unpleasant with a kind of shock absorber. That's where panoramic awareness comes in. That's where languaging can come in. Studies have shown, for example, when people simply note their experience, like, for example, fear, pain, happiness, lust, wanting to smoke some dope, just noting, not changing anything. We're still in the first of the three phases. We're just mindful. Just noting it activates prefrontal cortex and deactivates the amygdala. Just noting alone. So we can bring noting to bear to our wants or to the simple hedonic tone of pleasant or unpleasant. And that's a very deep practice. I think it's quite interesting that in Buddhism, just to take that as a point of departure, the Buddha allocated one of the four fundamental foundations of mindfulness to mindfulness of the hedonic tone, mindfulness of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, because that's the shock absorber that breaks the chain of suffering that typically moves from stimulus to hedonic tone to craving, clinging, and suffering. Right? Mindfulness of the hedonic tone itself creates space around it like a big shock absorber. Another key thing to do that I've really come to appreciate is to be skeptical of the promised pleasures or pains. It's interesting that in the kind of simulator, which is mainly localized in midline networks, the brain is continually generating potential rewards or potential penalties. But isn't it interesting that usually what we actually experience is not as great as promised? Or usually the pain we suffer is not as great as was promised. And I think that's because those presumed rewards or penalties are produced by limbic systems in the brain that are ancient and primitive and simplistic and very powerful. That's why standing back from really asking ourselves, are our expectations valid with regard to reward, truly accurate? Or are our expectations with regard to pain truly accurate? In Tibet, they have this great phrase, take the fruit as the path. In other words, take the goal as the method. And that's where this responsive reactive mode distinction really comes in. Because if the goal is responsive mode activation in its basic form in terms of calm, contentment, and caring, and then developed and even perhaps raised to a sublime level at the upper reaches of human potential in terms of calm, contentment, and caring, as we do that, every moment we spend in a relative state of inner peace, or a state of love, or a state of gladness. These are three synonyms: gladness for contentment, love for caring, peace for calm. Every moment we spend there, guess what? Good news. We are stimulating and therefore strengthening the neural substrates of the responsive mode. And I think that's fantastic news. So thanks for your attention. Time to break. Lunch. Thank you. Great.